As was mentioned, I wanted to share a little something with you before we get into the conversation. There will be a Q&A later. If we don't get to your question, you can always go to amortowles.com, and on the contact page, your questions or comments come straight to me. Now, this is an amazing thing about the modern times, that can happen. It has its pitfalls. And so I wanted to give you a sort of a flavor for how that can go right and wrong in a way. But the main thing to understand is that at this point, when a book of mine comes out, usually it takes about a week for the corrections to start rolling in. And some of them are helpful, some of them are not so helpful. And so I wanted to give you sort of a sense of that so you can gauge it for yourself. But by sharing just a couple here with you. So here is, a good example. This is an email I received. It says, "Dear Mr. Towles, you start too many sentences with ing words." Now, that is not helpful. But the best part about this email is how it ends. It ends looking forward to your next book. Right? But so here's another one that I wanted to share, and I have to set this up a little bit. So in the Lincoln Highway, towards the end of the book, the main character and his cronies are having a fancy dinner at a fine home in New York, and things go awry. And as a result, our hero, Emmett Watson, late at night is in the kitchen cleaning up everything by himself in an act of penance. And I received this email from Karen in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Karen writes, on page 477, sorry, this keeps turning. Page 477, you describe how Emmett was doing the dishes, saying that Emmett first washed the plates, then the crystal, then the pots. As the winner of the 1973 Betty Crocker Future Homemaker Award in my high school, I can tell you with some authority that the proper way to wash dishes is first the crystal, then the plates, and finally the pots. Thank you, Karen from Wisconsin. So I just say, well, I'll give one more, share one more with you here. And so the setup on this is that early in the novel, the hero Emmett, his Studebaker is borrowed, more or less, by two friends, Wooly and Duchess, and they head out east on the Lincoln Highway, headed towards New York. And they're going through Iowa, and they get through Ames, Iowa, and they run out of gas. They don't have any money. So Duchess gets out of the car. It's the morning. He looks up the road and he sees a liquor store, and he figures, all right, at this hour, the liquor store is probably not open. If I can break in, I might find some money in the till. Barring that, I could always take some bottles of whiskey and give those to the gas station attendant in exchange for gas. This is Duchess's plan. And so this is what I hear from Jane of Pequot Lake, Minnesota. There were no liquor stores in Ames, Iowa in 1954. Hard liquor and wine could only be purchased at the county seat. This meant that my parents, who were heavy drinkers, had to drive all the way to Boone County. Every week, my mother and I would drive to Boone in order to buy a case of Gallo wine, some Gallo vermouth, and a no-name bourbon. When you paid, the clerk would produce a large ledger where you had to write down your purchases and sign it. Now, the best part of this email is the P.S. P.S. I lived across the street from Miss Evans, my fourth grade teacher. She told my mom that Mr. Harlan, our principal, would review the liquor store log every week to see how much and what his teachers were drinking. Now, given that the Lincoln Highway has been out about 10 months now in the United States, at least, we are moving beyond the corrections phase, everybody. But if you want to send me your parents' drinking habits, you're welcome to do so. All right, so please.
This is great because it actually leads very seamlessly into my first question, which is, what was the research that you did for this book?
Not enough. No, that's a tough question after that setup. I'm not a research-driven novelist, so I do not pick a topic, research it, and write a book. Instead, what I do is I pick a topic that is grounded in something that I feel that I know deeply enough that I can write the story or imagine it fully without resorting to research in the early phases. And what I'll do instead is I'll kind of keep track of things that I would like to know better. And I will then do applied research once the first draft is complete. So for instance, in the case of A Gentleman in Moscow, I had never spent a night in the Metropole Hotel. And I don't speak Russian. I didn't study Russian history in college or anything like that. But I had a long love of Russian literature. And I used that as the foundation for inventing A Gentleman in Moscow, knowing that when I finished the first draft, I would go to Russia and move into the hotel for the first time and stay there. And that's what I did. I flew to Moscow when the first draft was over and began the revision process while in the hotel, sort of doing some applied work at that time. Similar thing here in the case of the Lincoln Highway. I had never heard of the Lincoln Highway when I began writing this book. I certainly had never been on it. And I discovered it in the course of writing the book in a way. And so when the first draft was finished, I flew to Nebraska and began driving east on the Lincoln Highway following the characters. And so this raises the question of why do I postpone doing applied research in my process? And the answer is really that I have found, both as a reader and as a writer, that I feel like when I'm reading a book that a lot of research has been done in preparation for the book, I can really feel it, and it doesn't really satisfy me. I sort of feel like the historical facts are dropping out of the sky into the narrative, and they can kind of clutter it up. You know, my job really is, I'm a novelist, I'm not an historian. My job is to imagine the characters as fully as possible so that they can feel like three-dimensional characters, three-dimensional people, really, to the reader, and to write in a manner that the poetics provide the reader an opportunity to read the book on many different layers, and approach the book from different directions. You know, that's really where my responsibility lies. And so I'm wary of that applied research, which can get in the way of bringing the characters to life or interfere with the poetry of the language to the detriment of a rich interpretation. That's my answer to that. Sorry.
So, I mean, putting applied research aside, you know, it is important to note this is Eisenhower's America. Nixon is still and only vice president. America has yet to invade Vietnam. So that kind of gives you a sense of where we are presidentially and possibly historically. You mentioned the characters. You mentioned Emmett Watson, your hero, our hero. Tell us about these characters in more detail. Emmett, his brother Billy, Duchess, Willie.
Okay. Well, so, I mean, for those of you who have not read the book, it has a relatively simple setup, and usually my work does. I mean, I've been writing fiction since I was a kid. I've had many stories for books and many ideas for books and stories over the course of my life. And when an idea strikes me, it usually is a very brief notion, like a guy gets trapped in a hotel for a long period of time. You know, that's where I started with A Gentleman in Moscow. Now, when I have an idea like that, it usually comes with some very rapid notions about it. So in the case of that, I immediately thought, oh, it could be in Russia. That'd be great. And he'll be an aristocrat sentenced to house arrest in a fancy hotel across the street from the Kremlin. And it'll span from the Cold War from the revolution to the Cold War. And that was all in the first couple of minutes. And then what will happen if the idea intrigues me is I will start to imagine every aspect of the story over a period of years in as much detail as possible. I kind of call it the design phase. I'll imagine every character, every event, settings, you know, the language to a great degree, gathering that information in notebook after notebook, and eventually, when I know enough, I'll start writing chapter one. So in the case of this story, the setup is that before the book begins, our hero Emmett Watson, as a 17-year-old high school student in Nebraska, goes to the county fair with his younger brother. A bully picks a fight with him. He punches the bully. The bully falls back, hits his head, and dies. And as a result, Emmett is sent to a work farm in Kansas for juvenile delinquents, in essence, to pay his debt. Now, the book opens then on the day that he has been released, and the warden is driving him home to the family farm. His mother is long gone. His father has died while he's doing time, and the farm is in foreclosure. But the warden is saying to Emmett, what happened to you was a freak accident. You're an honorable young man. You've paid your debt to society. So you should be ready to start your life anew. And Emmett says, that's his intention. But it turns out that two friends from the work farm have hidden in the trunk of the warden's car. And when the warden drives away, they present themselves to Emmett with a very different idea of what he should do with his near-term future. And that's kind of where we begin. And that was really the notion I started with, was two guys in the trunk of the car when someone is arriving home from having done some time. And right away, I thought, yeah, this is going to be good. It'll be set in the Midwest. The two friends, he'll be sort of an honorable, practical kid from the Midwest. The two friends will be from New York, but from two very different parts of New York. One would be sort of from an aristocratic background, but sort of a lost soul. The other will be sort of from a tougher part of New York, the son of failed vaudevillian drinker con man, and that'll be so that the three of them, and that's where we'll start, and that's kind of the way it begins. As I say, right away that stuff comes to me, and then you go through this design process. Now I knew right away that Emmett would have a younger brother, Billy, who would be very sort of thoughtful and precise, and he has a book that he reads over and over and over of sort of adventure stories and biographies, and that he would be sort of a very powerful sort of quiet presence around these three older, 18-year-olds, the other 18-year-olds. As they set out, Emmett's intention is to go with his brother to California, and Wooly and Duchess are going to take them towards New York instead. Right off the bat, I knew that the story would be a 10-day story. And so that was all part of the initial imagination. I know you were asking about the characters. What sort of thing I'll just dwell on here to sort of give you a flavor for how I think, which is with Duchess, the origin of Duchess as a character in the book, for those of you who've read it, is that I had this idea, this notion, what would it be like if you were a young man who wasn't very well educated, from New York, let's say, from the tougher part of New York, and your father was an educated person who was a vaudevillian, and as I say, a con man and a drunk too, but whose primary act was to do Shakespearean monologues, and so as a kid, you're surrounded by sort of rough theater types and people who exaggerate and people who lie and cheat and drink as vaudeville's dying. But your father, you've listened to him give 20 Shakespearean monologues 1,000 times. But, what would be the byproduct of that? Like, this sort of weird, crazy mix that would shape a boy, from the age of 8 to 18, having witnessed this. And in particular, if you think of like the Shakespearean monologues, even though this person's not very well educated, it would give them sort of a very high sense of how to describe things, and sort of a high sense of sort of purpose in the language, lots of flourish to it, and sort of the poetic sensitivity to the poeticness of language, but wouldn't necessarily know kind of the context in which the soliloquies come from. So like you hear a Hamlet soliloquy, and then you hear a Macbeth soliloquy. And if that's all you heard, you wouldn't really know, wait, which one's the good guy and which one's the bad guy? One's a hero and one's a murderer, but you don't know that. You just know this beautiful speech. And so that's kind of the sort of Duchess kind of was invented out of this notion, because that's really what his childhood experience is. And then I'm trying to imagine what would that be translate into when you're an 18-year-old in action.
I'm so glad you bring this up, Amor, because I think it highlights the book that you alluded to of Billy's big red book, The Compendium of Heroes, Adventurers, and Other Intrepid Travelers, which is essentially an alphabetical list of all of possibly the most famous warriors and seekers in the kind of canon, as it were. To what extent does Lincoln Highway kind of inscribe in that tradition? The tradition of the epic, and specifically the American epic, of course. Yeah,
thank you. I like to think of it as that the Lincoln Highway is, I'm not giving anything away here, it's just a fact. It's a journey story. And I think I like to use that word, and because I think it's the right word, in that if you think of the history of Western narrative for a second, the journey story is one of the oldest that we have in the Western tradition. So we can go back to the Greeks, and we have Homer's the Odyssey, where Ulysses has won the Trojan War, and the entire epic is just him trying to get home. That's all it is, the journey home for Ulysses. If we roll ahead to the Roman Empire, of course, the peak of narrative in the Roman Empire is Virgil's Aeneid, which is a journey story. And Aeneas has lost the Trojan War, and his family has been largely killed. All of his friends and neighbors, his government, his city's been burned to the ground. He sets out on a journey, and it's not to go home, it's to establish something new, right? We can keep moving forward, and you have the early stages of British narrative or English narrative, English language narrative. You have Chaucer's Canterbury Tales with the Pilgrims on the Road exchanging stories. Cervantes in Spanish, which is really the Don Quixote, which many view as the first novel, is a road story. And we can work our way into English in America, where in essence the serious American narrative begins almost at its peak with Herman Melville's Moby Dick, which itself is a journey narrative again. And so we have this long history of journey stories which are running through the Western canon. And why is the journey so interesting to writers again and again and again? And I think it's very simple. I think it's because if you look at the narrative in the Western tradition, it really is about how an individual or a small group of individuals go through change. You take an individual, small group of individuals, they're presented with obstacles, they're overcoming the obstacles, but in so doing, they are making decisions and taking actions which have moral implications for themselves and for others. They have ramifications. And by going through this, the individual or individuals are changed. They change by the experience they're going through and through the reflection of the meaning of what they've done or been forced to do or have chosen to do, et cetera. This is really what I've just described is virtually at the heart of every single novel, every narrative. That's what it is. It's the individuals facing these obstacles, making decisions, having implications, and then we see them as a different person at the end of the process. And in the 19th century, what happens is the novelists take this journey, the same idea, and it is from the bedroom to the tea parlor. That's the journey, is down the stairs to the back of the house. And that's big enough for Henry James, But all the things that I'm just talked about are occurring at the same level of intensity, the same drama in this sort of within the house, as it were. And so, yes, in writing this story, I was very conscious of the fact that it is a journey story. And so it was very natural for me to sort of sweep in the history of sort of these types of narratives explicitly into the story by having this 8-year-old boy have this compendium, many of which the stories are about adventurers and travelers. And so we can have kind of the parallel run side by side in real time.
So you've kind of defined the epic for us and given everyone here the key to reading all books moving forward.
That was for free.
One thing is for sure, you didn't mention the 20th century. What happens in the 20th century? This epic goes inside internally. So we think about Joyce's Ulysses. We were talking about it before our conversation. One defining characteristics is that epics are very long, right? Your book, over 500 pages, many of these epics, 500, 600, in the case of Joyce, 900 pages long. You comment on this, Amor, of kind of Woolley observing his compendium. So he says to himself, this thoughtful young 8-year-old, the funny thing about a story is that it can be told in all sorts of lengths. The thing about hearing a story like The Count of Monte Cristo from the 1,000-page version is that whenever you sense an exciting part is coming, you have to wait and wait and wait for it actually to arrive. But in Billy's big red book, so this is the Compendium of Heroes, the writer has chosen to tell the entire story over the course of 8 pages. So in his version, when you sense an exciting part coming, it arrives lickety-split. You're writing 500 plus page novels in the time of, I would call it lickety split entertainment. Not only lickety split entertainment, but lickety split every 30 seconds. How do you negotiate this tension?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I apologize for keep returning to A Gentleman in Moscow, but to answer this, it's such an interesting frame. One of the reasons I chose to write this story after A Gentleman in Moscow is because A Gentleman in Moscow is about a man who's in a hotel and doesn't come out. The reader doesn't come out either for 30 years. And, so when you're shifting and say, what am I going to do next? I've got all these ideas for stories and various notebooks and different things and different stages of development. And I was like, I'm going to do that one, the one about the 3 18-year-olds, because it allows me to shift gears. Suddenly I'm dealing with 18-year-olds who are not sophisticated or aristocratic. I'm doing it with movement instead of this, trapped in a hotel. And the story was always imagined as a 10-day tale instead of a 30-year saga. And that was a big attraction to me, and making that shift in particular. And actually, of all the differences between the books, that's the one that is, in a way, the most interesting and challenging, the duration. Because in a 30-year story, one of the advantages that I have as an author, and that hopefully you have as a reader, is that the story is about evolution. Kind of as I was describing earlier, you take a 30-year story and yes, naturally the character is going to evolve over time. The relationships are evolving over the time of that time period. The country that the character is in is evolving over time. And that's a very satisfying thing to write, and you hope it's a satisfying thing to read. In a 10-day story, you don't have the freedom to allow that to play out over time. So the challenge becomes, how do you give the reader a sense of the character's past, sort of the origins of who they are, and give them a sense of the decision-making and personality and the context of their experience that might give the reader a chance to sort of anticipate where they're going. So that even though it's in this narrow aperture of 10 days, that the reader can have a feeling of a more complete reading experience, like they've almost witnessed a whole life, even in this short time. Now, so that's kind of the challenge. The plus is what you're talking about, which is by setting it in 10 days, even though it's 500 pages or whatever it is that it adds a certain momentum to the storytelling that a 30-year story is never going to have, because that 30-year story, we're going to have to go through another decade and another decade, and we're going through these slow evolutionary changes. In the 10-day story, you really get to bring each day fully to its realization. And it feels like it's happening in real time for the reader. And that's a very different kind of reading experience. So as I say, the challenge is if I'm going to give the reader that experience of pace, how do I make sure that it also has the breadth and depth that is built into the longer tale?
I think another challenge that you set for yourself is that, so each section, each day is broken into kind of 4, 5, 6, depending on the characters who we're privy to, and in some cases not privy to. So you put us inside the heads of Duchess and Willie, while we never enter the heads of Emmett or Billy, at least. I mean, it seems you're playing with the first person and the third person,
yes,
right?
Yeah, I'm teasing you a little bit. I'm making a face at her, but here's because it is true.
That was conscious. I mean,
yes. So here's how I think about that, and this is why I don't mean to give you a hard time, but is that
please give me a hard time.
That what we haven't said earlier is that the book is told from 8 different perspectives, and it goes back and forth from different characters. So the 10 days, you are learning of the events of the 10 days as the narrative is shifting from the different perspectives. Now, and each day it's different. You might, the first day you only hear from 2 of the characters, but there are days where you hear from 6 or 7 of the characters in a single day. I have not, as a novelist, yet written in the omniscient third person, because what Alice is referencing is that of the 8 characters, the 8 perspectives we hear in this novel, 2 are in the first person, Duchess and Sally. The other 6 are in the third person. But I, as a novelist, have not written in the omniscient third person for you yet. And, the omniscient third person is, that technical term that describes the narrator who knows everything. They know what's happened before the book, what's happened after, what's happened to each of the characters in their private moments. The narrator knows what they're thinking, what they're feeling, knows what the characters don't know. And in this great Jamesian sense, sort of delivers you the world, right? And from high above. I've not written books in that form. So like The Gentleman in Moscow, for instance, is third person. For anybody who's read it, I hope you sense that while it's written he this, he that, it's really an expression of his internal reality. So the language is his, the sense of humor is his, the foibles are his, the memories, of course, are his. The poetics of the language is an extension of his internal life. So in the Lincoln Highway, even though it's being told from 8 perspectives, and 6 of them in third person, each of the third person sections is an extension of that character's individuality. So that hopefully, as you're reading, the Emmett section sounds very different from the Woolley section or the Ulysses section, even though they're all third person narratives. Because the challenge for me is to bring into that third person narrative a distinctive tone to the language, distinctive vocabulary, distinctive semantics, a distinctive style of thinking, which allows us into the interior life of that character, even though it's third person. So, that's the way the book is constructed. It's trying to get you into the head of the individuals, whether it's first person or third person. For me, is a very narrow distinction in what I'm trying to do in the case of this book.
Do you think you will write in the omniscient?
I kind of am. I'm kind of tempted to do that, and again, and kind of in the shifting gears world, like every now and then I'm reading a third person novel, and I'm like, oh, that's fun. You get to say all that, that's great, because it's a different kind of, there's a great freedom to being that third person omniscient narrator, and it's a very different kind of linguistic goal, because you're not building a person. There is a personality to a third person narrator sometimes, an omniscient narrator, but oftentimes it's not. In a way, you almost feel it's the personality of the author that you're hearing, or of this imagined author. But I have really enjoyed as a writer trying to build stories where the language that you're reading is the language of the character, and that it will not be the same as, in essence, as the language of the next thing you read by me.
I think it's the language of the character, but it's also the language of the time in which it's set.
Well, that's a part of the challenge too, sure.
And this is what I wanted to ask you about next, Amor, which is that this is the America that we're not necessarily used to reading about today, let's say in the newspaper, certainly not as European newspapers want to cover America. This is America of kind of homemade applesauce, ice boxes, Parcheesi, phrases like waste. Yeah, I mean, I had to look that up as a Brit. Phrases like waste not, want not, words like zing. You have characters who delight in unnecessary actions, kind of unproductive actions. Did writing this book feel like a refuge to you from contemporary America?
Yeah, maybe that may have been a draw to doing the book, I guess. I mean, I love my current life, so I don't wander the streets of New York with a sense of doom, but there are many aspects of the modern life that are fretful, politically, technologically, whatever. I don't know, whatever the stuff is, but so was kind of nice to retreat into a moment that was different in style and shape, and I certainly chose, even if unconsciously, the mid 50s, not because of what was happening so much as what was about to happen. And I've written about this a little bit in the after, right? The book came out, or on my website, let's say that I've written about this. I didn't think about this until I was finished with the book, by the way, but the book is set in June of 1954. And if you go back and think about it, the modern civil rights movement in 1954 is about to begin. The civil rights movement has existed since the beginning of the nation, because slavery has been a part of American culture since the beginning of the nation. But the modern civil rights movement begins in the summer of 1954 because of the decision of Brown versus the Board of Education, which makes segregation illegal. There was this 100-year
unconstitutional.
Yes, correct. Well, in that sense, illegal. Yes, exactly right. So you had a 100-year period where a large portion of the country said we're going to interpret the post-slavery era as one where we can separate the black and white communities. And as long as they both have access to education, we're fulfilling the ideals of the Constitution. And eventually, after 100 years, the Supreme Court says no, requiring black people and white people, black people in particular, obviously, to have their version of the services isolated from the rest of the community is not meeting the standard of the Constitution. So you now have to unwind all of that. And so sure enough, within 18 months of that decision, you have Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on the bus. The march that is then a protest march when she gets arrested is led by the young Martin Luther King, and things take off like a rocket. We have a decade of active civil rights activity in the United States that culminates with the Civil Rights Act in 1964. 1954 is when the sexual revolution is about to begin in the United States. Hugh Hefner's Playboy is published in December of 53. And, it's worthwhile to kind of take a step back and remember what Hefner was doing. Hefner's thing was pornography should not be bought in a back alley by a guy in a trench coat and carried away in a paper bag. Is that it should be, open in culture. And so his vision was, I'm going to create a magazine with nudity, but, the nudity is going to be sort of classy, but there's going to be interviews with statesmen, and there's going to be short stories by great American writers. This is going to all be bound into this magazine. And so as a result, you shouldn't have to buy it in an alley or be ashamed of it. It should be on the cocktail table in your living room. That was his vision. And he won that war, basically. And so this is all just about to happen. So the changing views, and of course, the pill is in development at this point. The Kinsey Report on Female Sexuality comes out in 54, where suddenly that's just something you could talk about, which hadn't ever been talked about in polite society, or even impolite society. So all this is about to happen. Rock and roll is about to happen, because it's invented in the summer of 1954, basically with rock around the clock. And that's going to lead to all kinds of changes in American society, particularly a youth movement like no society had ever seen in the history of humanity, really. This notion of 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, and 20-year-olds bonding across the nation through music and rallying against all kinds of dynamics, whether it was the war or racial oppression or equal rights for women or sexual freedom. All of it is boiling up through rock and roll, in the 1960s. So as I say, all this stuff is about to happen. And so, yes, it's sort of you were asking about the contemporary world. And yes, this is a haven from that, but in a way it was a haven from the 60s too, the 50s were. And so, and I'm not trying to say that what I wanted to do was write a book about that was a better world. I certainly am not saying that. More that by dialing back to 54, what it allowed me to do is simplify the landscape, where all the stuff that's going to light up the 60s and affect America for the next 50 years is there, but it's not, beating like a drum in everybody's ears. So that at least allows me to sort of tonally write in a style that the reader can feel these things under the surface of events and affecting the characters in different ways in this sort of quiet, poetic way with big implications. And, and that's kind of what I think why I chose to write in that moment, as opposed to say in 1968, where it would all be on the surface of the book.
This is fascinating because we mentioned, I'll mention again Joyce's Ulysses, but he writes it from 1917 to 1921, right? So just after the First World War, but he sets it in 1904.
That's right, sure, yeah.
So he says of this as a kind of famous scene where these young boys are playing field hockey very violently and viciously, and he says that for him that somehow prefigured the violence, the male violence of the First World War. What for you is an example of this kind of subdued, poetic seed that will burgeon and blossom? And
I wish you'd sent me that question in advance.
Or maybe you can talk about your character Ulysses.
There's one of the characters, and then I'm not giving away much in this, but one of the characters in the book is a Black American who fought in the Second World War, whose name is Ulysses. And Emmett and his younger brother Billy, end up on a freight train headed east at one point in the narrative, and I had this notion that Billy would be left alone in the freight car as Emmett is in essence going to look for food, and that he would suddenly find himself in danger, and he would be then get out of danger because of this Black American who suddenly appears, and his name is Ulysses. Now, the key thing here that drives this moment for these two characters is that Ulysses rides the trains by himself. So having helped this boy, he basically says, "Okay, now you got to go. When the train slows, I'm going to throw you off the train. I'm going to, gently. I'm going to drop you when the train's slow." And that's his intention. And we learn that Ulysses has a very troubled past. I mean, in that he was married, love of his life, has a child. His wife is pregnant, and he has a deferment from the Second World War. But as the war is going on, Ulysses is finding it harder and harder and harder to stay home and do his job for the phone company as he's watching his peers go to war. And he's now in his community. He suddenly is surrounded by widows, by men who've lost their sons who've lost their fathers, and he is repairing lines for the phone company. It's this critical job, but eventually he just says, "I can't do it anymore. I'm going to the war." And his wife is pregnant. She says, "If you go to the war, that's fine. I understand why you would do that, but don't bother coming back looking for us." And he goes to the war. He comes back, and his wife and child are gone. And that's how he then boards the next train, and he kind of never gets off. He's been riding the trains ever since for almost a decade, and or 8 years basically. And what happens is he basically says, "Okay, Billy, you're going to have to go now." And Billy has sort of had a glimpse of another person who was there briefly has called this man by Ulysses, the name Ulysses. And Billy, he's about to let him go, and Billy says, "Hey, he sort of doesn't realize he's being thrown off. He's about to be thrown off the train." He says, did you fight in a war?" And he's like, "Yes, I fought in the war." And he says, "Was it overseas?" And he says, "Yes, we were all overseas." And he said, Did you go reluctantly?" And he says, "Well, yeah, yes." And he says, "Well, did you leave a wife and son behind?" And at this point, the man is getting, unsettled by this young boy asking this series of questions. And he says, "Yes, I left a wife and child, behind." And he says, "Well, I know who you were named for." And he says, "We all know who I was named for. Ulysses Grant, the man that Lincoln's sword, the sword in Lincoln's hand." And he's like, No. You were named for the great Ulysses." And he says, and he says, "Let me read it to you. I'll show you." And he reads this story, and it has great impact on this, older man, because Billy makes the point that at the end of the Odyssey, he gets home, and it takes 10 years. And you've been 8.5 years on the trains. Well, you're almost done. And so the old was quite shaken. So what I loved about this, here I am, in love with my own book. I apologize. It's unattractive, I know, but nonetheless,
it's really good.
I want to share this one. What I love about this scene is Ulysses, they affect each other quite significantly over the course of the book from this moment forward. And what I love about it in retrospect is that the whole relationship, which is very equitable between the two of them, and it becomes quite profound between the two of them, is it stems from the fact that this single word has two meanings. And the fact that one of them comes with, "Oh, Ulysses means this." No, it means that. It kind of is this kind of an X, if you were. And it requires each of them to then sort of, through the axis of the X, to explain their side of what that word means. And the nexus of where those two things meet is this enormous transition from one person to another and back of not only sort of what the word means, but kind of all of the meaning of their life that is behind it, and that this is the way the human connection can happen, is through this little kind of portal. And that, that all the connections come out of that. And so anyway, I don't even remember how I got started on this. But anyway, yes, that's the story of Ulysses.
In the interest of time, I will ask you one more question that I imagine somebody might have asked anyway. So thinking about more about kind of geometry, I'm glad we have the vision of the X. We can think about just a through line. Woolly, we learn towards the end of the book, is related to Wallace Walcott. So Woolly stands for Walcott.
Yes, that's right.
Great fans of Amor Towles will know that Wallace Walcott features in Rules of Civility, and Wallace Walcott is Woolly's uncle. Apart from this small detail, what, if any, through line do you see running through your three novels, or do you reject the question of a through line, which is
no, I don't reject. So there's a lot of narrative connection between Rules of Civility, for those who've read it, and the Lincoln Highway. And yes, there's this character who's central in Rules of Civility named Wallace Walcott. His nephew is Woolly in the Lincoln Highway. Wallace gives a watch. Actually, it's actually the watch I'm wearing right now. He gives a black-faced watch from the First World War. Woolly was given to, sorry, Wallace Walcott was given, it was given to him by his father, who fought in the First World War. And then he gives it to his young nephew in the course of the Rules of Civility. And that watch then reappears in the Lincoln Highway. The Walcott family home, their summer home in the Adirondacks, plays an important role in both of the two books. So there are these kind of connections. And, why do I do that? You don't have to know, you don't have to read Rules of Civility to enjoy a Lincoln Highway or vice versa. You don't have to know about these connections. But I do think if you've read both and they become aware of them, again, they sort of, it's like a doorway that they provide an opportunity to make connections that may be intriguing for you, and may add sort of this level of entertainment that wouldn't be there in a book that feels fully circumscribed, as it is only a standalone thing. And I do this partly because I enjoyed it so much as a young reader, or as a, that wasn't that young at the time, but reading Faulkner. And in his Yoknapatawpha County, you would bump into people from book to book, or from novel to short story. You'd bump into a building or an event in the past that has had repercussions in the context of two different of his books, and it's getting re-referenced, and I just loved that. It was really electric for me as a reader when that would happen, and so it was a pleasure for me to kind of say, to sort of build that kind of into my work. The wildest one in the Lincoln Highway, which I will share with you, is that you may know about this, and I was 90% of the way through writing the Lincoln Highway. And what happened was that Lincoln Highway, I was like, okay, set in the 50s, as I said, 54 feels right because of all, it's kind of a quiet moment in America. And I wanted the characters, they're going to be rushing towards this Adirondack home, but they need to get there before everybody arrives in summer. So like July 1st, they got to get there. So I'm like, so it should be in mid to late June. So I'm kind of writing the book, and, it's 10 days and sort of moving towards the 20th of June, 21st of June. And I'm writing literally the last chapter, which is, takes place on the 21st of June. And all of a sudden I realized, oh my God, A Gentleman in Moscow, this 30-year story, ends on the 21st of June, 1954. That's the date that book ends on. And when I had written at this point the draft, the Lincoln Highway was 10 days and ended on the 20th of June. And I'm like, well, we can fix that, So I shoved the whole narrative forward a day, and created minor problem. But anyway, so I've shoved it away and wrote it. And now the culminating moment in A Gentleman in Moscow is it, for those of you who've read it, remember, it's at midnight on the 21st of June, 1954, when all the telephones in the Metropole Hotel start ringing simultaneously. And in the Lincoln Highway, the culminating moment, which is with Emmett and his brother Billy in their car setting out, that occurs at 5 p.m. on the 21st of June, 1954. But given the time change, it's right, 7-hour time difference for Moscow, it means that the two books end at the exact same moment in historical time. Now, it doesn't make any difference. I think this is hilarious, That doesn't make any difference whether anybody notices it. It doesn't change the books. But I love, because for me, what I think I love about it is it's very true to the way I think about stories in both written and in life, which is that, here's this 30-year saga, and here's a 10-day story, one by this fine aristocrat, the other by these young boys, who are unsophisticated. And yet they end at the same moment in historical time because that's what happens. A moment in time encompasses millions of stories, the beginnings of 1 million stories, and the ends of 1 million other stories at any moment in time. and the duration of those stories differ, and the themes of those stories differ. And I'm talking about in real life, today, right here in Paris. People are falling in love and people are falling out of love, and they're, getting born and dying, and all these various stories beginning and ending in different paces. And so I love that, sort of tipping a hat to that through this bizarre connection.
So it might be a nice way to end our conversation to read a lovely quote that you write. How easily we forget, we in the business of storytelling, that life was the point all along. Thank you, Amor Towles.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. So are we doing questions? Or?
We have questions. But for in-person questions, I will refer you to Miss Emily Biggs, who will come over with a microphone. So are there any in-person questions? Yes, on the front row.
Thank you for your books. I love them. And I love listening to you. With the Lincoln Highway, I read it. And then I don't know why, but I kept thinking about Mark Twain, boy on a journey. So I decided to listen to it. And I don't know if you were part and parcel of picking who the narrators were, but they were fabulous. And I think listening to that Lincoln Highway was one of the greatest pleasures I've ever had. And so I'm not asking you a question.
Okay, that's a great question. That was a terrific question. But I will say that I am involved in who does the audio for my books, and so usually it starts by they say, "What are you looking for?" So in the case of General Mosca, I said, "I think you're looking for an actor with Shakespearean training from England, because I think that person's gonna be able to deliver both the language and the sense of aristocracy to the American listener. Because even if he's from Liverpool, he'll sound like a count to America, me included, So we did that. And so now in the case of Lincoln Highway, they said, "What are you looking for?" And I said, "Listen, I said, I think you're going to, I don't care if all of the young, of all the various male characters are done by the same actor, that's fine. They could be 6 different actors. But I think you do want a woman to do the part of Sally, and I think you want a Black American to do the character of Ulysses." And there's a political aspect to that in the modern era, but it's more than that, which is I as a listener, I would have found it, distracting to have this guy who'd been doing the story suddenly reading the character of Sally, this very forceful, terrific sort of personality in a first-person narrative. So that's what we ended up doing. We got Eduardo Ballerini, who's this terrific, really one of the great audiobook people to do the 6 white men, and we have 2 other actors for the woman and Ulysses, and I think it works very well. Thank you.
Do we have a question back there?
Hello. So I had a question about it being set in Nebraska, because I am also a fellow Nebraskan. Woo! Go Huskers! Yes. So the reason you chose to set it in Nebraska, was it purely geographical, or was it another reason, like a personal connection? Because I know a lot of stories that are set in the Midwest, they normally start in Oklahoma or the famous Kansas. Hello, Wizard of Oz. But why Nebraska?
It was a couple of things. Geographic was a big part of it. And in that I knew that where I was setting the story was in essence the center, the east-west center of the nation. It's close to the north-south center of the nation too, but it was definitely the east-west, and that matters more in the context of the story. But more importantly was the sense of I wanted the personality of Emmett and the tone of the Emmett narrative to come out of sort of a Midwestern tradition, or at least how I interpret that, because that was going to be this, in essence, the bedrock of the narrative as you hear other more colorful and adventurous or risk-taking voices around him. I really wanted him to be this very a person that we can rely on and who is practical and is not an exaggerator and never a liar, and et cetera. And that he would sort of be moving forward very purposefully in a style of narrative that was sort of stripped down relative to the other characters. And so that kind of added to that. And that concept. One of the ways I put it, I was in it was in England, and I was trying to describe this for an audience who's not as familiar with what it would mean to be from rural Nebraska. Americans all around the country have some sense of what that might mean, and what had occurred to me kind of was, and this sort of puts in a relief. There is a tradition in the Midwest. My father was from Missouri, but there's a tradition in the Midwest of neighborliness, and it goes back more than 100 years, and it comes from a very specific root, which was that in the early days of the Midwest, where those were taking over the land grants, the pioneers who were moving, which was an enormously ethnically diverse group, because the ones who took over the land in Kansas and Nebraska and Iowa, it was Swedes and Finns and the French and Germans. It was a whole Italians. It was this enormous array of immigrants coming through New York and heading out, to the West. Some of them knew how to farm and some who did not, but taking raw land, and it was very hard living. And so in that environment, you might have lived a mile from your nearest neighbor, or half a mile. You might have been 5 miles from town and 20 miles from a doctor. So your life could depend upon the relationship you had with your nearest neighbors. It did depend upon. And so you have, through time, even this enormously diverse ethnic environment, with all kinds of religious sects, meaning mostly within the Christian tradition, but very sectarian, you could trust each other to come when needed, to bring food, to raise a barn, to get you to a doctor, whatever. That was a part of the culture of the times. Now you think about that in comparison to New York City, whether in 1850, 1880, 1920, 1940, Duchess's life, where in New York City, your life could depend upon being suspicious of your neighbor, because that's true. When there was a knock at the door at 9 o'clock at night, you look through the little hole and say, why is that person knocking on my door? I'm from downstairs. Can you open the door? Wait, what do you mean? Why do you need to open why? I don't recognize you. So it's a whole different mindset. And the important thing to recognize, because it is true, that actually does get handed down culturally, familiarly, through family, through behavior, through all kinds of things. And you kind of have a very different personality. Now, obviously, I'm not trying to say that everybody in the Midwest is the same person, but you can have these threads of behavior and an ethos that in one slice of America that is very different from another for very good reasons, neither of which is wrong. And so that was a part of it too. I wanted Emmett to grow out of that one because I knew that Duchess was going to be growing out of this other one.
We do have neighbors in England, I will point out.
Yeah. Well, no, but I know.
And we'll spell it with a U.
Yeah, yeah, right. That's right.
We have a question on Zoom from I think 2 people, 1 question. Fernando and Rita Kalida ask if the book is movie material. Has it been optioned? Did you have a movie in mind?
I don't write certainly with film in mind, but I'm very happy. I'm happy to have if my books end up being Meet the Screen, that sounds like fun. I'll just give you the overall picture here. Gentleman in Moscow was just announced 2 weeks ago. Ewan McGregor will star as the Count, and they're going to start shooting in February, and that'll be out next year as a miniseries for streaming. And I think that's great. I think Ewan McGregor is perfect for the Count. I really do. I think it's gonna be great. Rules of Civility has been in development for 10 years, but is being written. It's going to star Daisy Edgar-Jones, the young British talent who was in recently Where the Crawdads Sing, and Sally Rooney's book Normal People. She's amazing, and she'll star in that. And that'll be more like probably come out in a year and a half. Lincoln Highway I have not optioned to anybody yet. I have been involved a little bit, and I did some writing for the Rules of Civility guys. I did some writing for the Gentleman in Moscow guys. They had at one point scripts they didn't like for the pilots, and they said, would you take a crack at it, because we'd like to see how you would do it. In neither case are they going to use my work in total, and they may use some of the things I did. But it was a very good experience for me, because what I learned from doing that, I learned a very important lesson about myself, which is that turns out I am not a collaborator. I don't like to collaborate. I'm terrible at it. And so it's really not the right place for me, because writing for Hollywood is a very collaborative process. Not only are there multiple people in the room writing the work, but you are writing in response to feedback from an enormous array of people who have different agendas. And you have to really be open to that and dig that in order to survive. And whereas like I was going to kill myself, or somebody else, and it's like, it's not worth it. So anyway, so I would not do that next time. But anyway, yeah.
So I think we have one time for one more question. Yes, at the back.
Hi. I feel like we've been avoiding spoilers, so I don't want to mess anything up.
That's correct. You should not do that. Yeah.
Because well, never mind. Then I was just going to say I was pretty shocked by the last chapter.
Yeah, that's okay.
Like very, very shocked.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you this. Okay. I'll tell you this. So make it a little easier. First of all, you're welcome to grab me afterwards. Second of all, there was enough people, who wrote to me and said, I want to hear your thoughts about the final 2 chapters, and because of for various reasons. So at amortowles.com, when I finish writing a book, I do a Q&A where I kind of ask myself, what would I want to know about the book? And so I asked myself a series of questions, why the 1950s, why the Midwest, or whatever, why multiple perspectives, and some of the things we talked about tonight. But then once the book has been out for a while, I add to the bottom answers to frequently asked questions. And those are questions that come from readers, the ones that come more than once, multiple times. And the very last one is, what's with the ending? So you can go there and see my take on it, in which you can read or not read. But as I say, you can also just grab me after this, and I will tell you whatever you'd like to know, or hear you out. I will say this week, literally this week, I got an email from someone, and it says, dear Mr. Towles, I assume that this is not Mr. Towles. This must be somebody, in the office of the publisher. I am extremely disappointed in the ending, and for the following reasons. And I get ones where people love the ending, but anyway, but so she's disappointed. So I have taken the liberty of rewriting it to give Mr. Towles a sense of how it should have ended, because I strongly encourage the paperback to be changed accordingly. And I love that. Like, that would be great. If I went back and rewrote the ending for the paperback. But anyway, I couldn't read her whole thing, I got to say. I mean, the 3 pages, I'm reading my own ending, but like a different version. And so I did not read that part of the email. But
Amor, thank you so much.
You know what? Can I do one other thing? You guys have been very generous with time, but I did want to close with one little thing, which is I wanted to share with you. I do get questions about sort of, and we're kind of I'm making jokes at the beginning about the corrections and that end up in that being made in my work or whatever. I did want to share with you sort of the way I think of history in my work, and the role it plays. And the best way that I can do that is by comparison, or through a sort of an illusion, as it were. And the illusion is a stage play. So imagine that you are in the audience right now to see, or you're seeing a play. Let's call it, let's say it's Chekhov's The Cherry Orchard. And, you're looking up on the set. And right now on the set, it's a wealthy estate in the Russian countryside. And at the very back of the set, there's French doors. And through the French doors, you can actually see the cherry orchard in the distance. It's springtime. The trees are in bloom. So you can see the white and pink blossoms sort of moving in the afternoon, light breeze in the distance through the windows. Now, then you have the French doors. On either side of the French doors are bookcases. They're built out of plywood by the crew, but they're painted to look like mahogany because it's a fancy home. On one side, there's a staircase that goes nowhere. Over here, there's a door that goes nowhere. Those have been built by the stage crew too. But in front of that, you have an actual table surrounded by actual chairs on which there's an actual china tea service. And it's very important that these things be actual, because let's say that there's a sister, she's sitting at the table having tea by herself, and the brother comes out and, in a sort of a state of high emotion, you can tell, and he pulls back the chair and sits down and pulls himself up to the table to speak with his sister. You want to hear that sound of the wooden legs dragging across the surface of the wooden stage, and you want to hear it, him pulling himself up to the table. Now, as he starts saying what's on his mind to his sister, and he's working himself up sort of into a high emotion, and he slaps the surface of the table, you want to hear that physicality of that human hand hitting the surface of the wood. And when she, sort of in response, having listened very patiently, puts her teacup down in the saucer, you want to hear the china of the cup clinking against the china of the saucer in this delicate, patient fashion. And because that's very critical, in essence, to the experience of watching the scene unfold. Now, this is how my work is structured. And history is the painted backdrop of the cherry orchard. Because when you look through the French doors, you're not seeing a cherry orchard. What you're seeing is painted canvas. That's what you do at the back of a stage. You paint using the tricks of the Renaissance, give you a sense of depth of field and perspective. I have this, image of trees fading into the distance. Now, when the crew painted that cherry orchard to hang at the back of the stage, they didn't paint it in a realist fashion, right? What they're going to do is they're going to do it in an impressionist style, like Renoir or Monet, sort of a slightly fuzzy version, because that's going to look good to the naked eye. In the distance, by using the Monet or the Renoir impressionist style, it's going to make you see the movement of the petals. It's going to give a sense of the light that's dappling. And it makes sense because at that distance, it should be a little out of focus to the human eye. It would look weird if it were hyper-realist, right? So that's history for me, it's this impressionist thing at the far back of the stage, which is to give you a sense of time, of place, of mood, but that's it. Now, in front of that, in my work, is a lot of plywood that's been painted to look like mahogany. And that's the stuff where hopefully as you're reading, you're like, wait a second, did this really happen? Is this really there in New York City, this thing he's describing? It sounds like it could be, but maybe it's not. And I like it, there's things in my book that are absolutely true from history that sound like they're not, and they're things that are totally made up that I'm hoping you're thinking are real. And that's a great little line that some of my work travels, and that's the plywood painted to look like mahogany. But in front of that is really where I'm focused. And that's the characters sitting around the table. And just like in the stage set, that has to be very real, feel very real to you as the reader. So real that when you're reading a section, I want you to feel like you are sitting at that table, that you know the room well enough, you know the characters well enough, you know the stakes of the moment well enough, that you're sitting there and you are listening to the conversation. And you are analyzing, interpreting, sensing what the two characters, the brother and the sister, mean by interpreting their facial expressions, by the tone in which they say things, by the historical context of their lives and how it's informing what they say to each other as they exchange ideas and sentiments. And that's what I want to feel very real to you, because that's where the real action is.